Commander stood at the edge of the ridge and looked down at the valley below. The twin suns of IV were setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. It would have been beautiful if she was not preparing to die. Behind her, 43 soldiers rested against rocks and makeshift barriers. Most of them were wounded. Some would not survive the night even without the enemy. They were all that remained of the 3rd Battalion, once 800 strong. The ambush at Hollowed Pass had changed everything. Turned her 4 arms and checked her plasma lance for the 10th time. The charge indicator showed 12%. 12%. That was perhaps 20 shots if she was careful. After that, she would fight with her blade. After that, with her claws. After that, with her teeth if necessary. Lieutenant climbed up to join her. His left arm hung useless at his side, burned by enemy fire during the retreat. His scales, once bright green, were now dull with exhaustion and pain. "Commander," he said quietly, "the scouts have returned. The Dominion forces are massing in the Eastern Valley. They number at least 2,000. Closed her eyes. 2,000 against 43. The mathematics of death were simple. "How long?" she asked. "They will reach us by morning. 6 hours, perhaps 7. Nodded slowly. She had known this was coming. The Crucible Dominion did not leave survivors. They did not accept surrender. They conquered, they consumed, and they moved on to the next world. The collective had been fighting them for 3 cycles now, and they were losing. Badly. "The communication array?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Destroyed in the retreat. We cannot reach command. We cannot call for reinforcement." There would be no reinforcement anyway. The main fleet was engaged on the other side of the system. No one was coming to save them. This ridge would be their grave. Walked among her soldiers. She knew every face, every name. There was Sergeant, the best scout in the battalion, sharpening his blade with steady hands. There was Corporal, barely out of training, trying to hide her fear behind a mask of determination. There was Old, who had served under his mother and had refused to retire even when his joints began to fail. They all looked up at her as she passed. They were waiting for her to speak. They deserved words of comfort, words of hope, but had never been good at lying. She climbed onto a flat rock so they could all see her. The dying light caught her silver scales and made them glow. "Soldiers of the 3rd," she said, her voice carrying across the ridge, "I will not lie to you. We are surrounded. We are outnumbered. We are cut off from any help. By this time tomorrow, most of us will be dead." No one moved. No one spoke. They had already known this truth. But continued, we do not measure our lives by their length. We measure them by their meaning. And tomorrow, our lives will mean something." She raised her damaged plasma lance. "The Dominion thinks we are broken. They think we are easy prey. They will send their soldiers up this ridge expecting to find frightened remnants waiting to die. Instead, they will find warriors." A few soldiers straightened their backs. A few hands tightened on weapons. "We cannot win," said honestly, "but we can make them pay. We can make them bleed for every step they take. We can show them that the do not break. We can give our people a story worth telling, a last stand worth remembering. When they speak of the 3rd Battalion, they will speak of the warriors who made the enemy weep." The soldiers began to strike their chest plates with their fists. The sound echoed across the ridge like a heartbeat. "Rest now," said. "Eat what food we have. Check your weapons. Say whatever prayers give you comfort. And when the morning comes, we will show the Dominion what it costs to corner a soldier." The soldiers dispersed to their positions. Some talked quietly in small groups. Others sat alone with their thoughts. A few managed to sleep. Them. She returned to the ridge edge and watched the darkness swallow the valley. Somewhere out there, 2,000 enemies were preparing to kill her people. She wondered if the Dominion commander was sleeping well tonight. She hoped not. The hours passed slowly. The stars emerged, unfamiliar patterns that reminded how far from home she was going to die. She thought about her family, her mother who had commanded armies, Her father, who had raised her with gentle hands and fierce love. Her sister, who was probably still alive somewhere, fighting her own battles. She hoped they would understand. She hoped they would be proud. Around midnight, something changed. A light streaked across the sky, bright and fast. It was not a star. It was not a Dominion vessel. The trajectory was wrong and the color was unfamiliar. It burned through the atmosphere and disappeared behind the hills to the north. Then came the sound of impact, a distant boom that rolled across the valley. Appeared at her side. A crash, he said, small vessel by the look of it. Frowned, Dominion scout. The design was wrong. I have never seen anything like it. Curiosity stirred in his chest. Probably it meant nothing. Probably it was just debris from the orbital battle, some destroyed ship finally falling to the surface. But in her current situation, anything unknown was worth investigating. Take in 2 others, she ordered. Scout the crash site. If it is a Dominion vessel, destroy it. If there are survivors, bring them here. If there is anything useful, weapons, supplies, power cells, salvage what you can. Bowed his head, and if it is something else entirely. Thought for a moment. Then we will deal with that when it happens. Go quickly, be back before dawn. Gathered his team and disappeared into the darkness. Watched them go, then turned her eyes back to the stars. Something had fallen from the sky. In the stories her mother used to tell, that was often how things changed. A stranger arriving at the darkest hour, a gift from the heavens when all hope was lost. But those were just stories. Real life did not work that way. Still, as settled in to wait, she found that her heart was beating just a little faster. For the first time since the ambush, something unexpected had happened. And in war, the unexpected was sometimes the only friend you had left. The night continued its slow march toward dawn, toward battle, toward death. But perhaps, just perhaps, toward something else as well. Sergeant moved through the darkness like a shadow. Behind him, and 2 young soldiers followed as quietly as they could. The crash site was perhaps 2 kilometers north of the ridge, hidden behind a series of low hills covered in thick purple vegetation. As they approached, raised his fist, the group stopped. He could smell smoke now and something else. A chemical scent he did not recognize. The wreckage was close. They crept over the final hill and looked down. The ship was small, smaller than a shuttle. It had torn a long scar through the vegetation before coming to rest against a cluster of rocks. Parts of it were still burning with strange blue flames. The design was completely unfamiliar. Curved lines, compact structure, markings in a script that had never seen. Not Dominion, whispered. Agreed, he had fought the Dominion for 2 cycles. He knew their ships, their weapons, their technology. This was something else entirely. They approached carefully, weapons ready. The ship's hull was breached in several places. Through the gaps, could see the glow of damaged systems sparking in the darkness. Then he saw movement. He raised his plasma lance and aimed at the largest breach. Something was moving inside. Something was alive. Come out slowly, he called. We are armed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a figure emerged from the wreckage. Had seen many species in his life. The galaxy was vast and filled with strange creatures, but he had never seen anything quite like this. The creature was roughly humanoid in shape, but it had only 2 arms. Its skin was soft and pink, without scales or armor of any kind. It had hair on its head, dark and matted with blood. Its eyes were round and expressive, blinking in the dim light. It wore a damaged flight suit covered in the same strange markings as the ship. Most striking of all, it was small, shorter than at least a head. It looked fragile, like something that would break easily. The creature raised its hands, showing they were empty. It said something, but the words were meaningless sounds. Then it tapped a device on its chest and spoke again. I am not enemy, the creature said. The voice was distorted, clearly running through a damaged translator. Please not shoot. I am not enemy. kept his weapon raised. "What are you, what species?" The creature tapped its translator again. "Human, I am human. Name is Grace, I am pilot, survey pilot. My ship was hit in orbital battle, I crash here, I am not enemy." Studied the human. It was injured. One of its arms hung at a strange angle, clearly broken. There were cuts on its face and dark bruises forming on its skin, yet it stood steadily, meeting their eyes without fear. "You are alone?" asked. "Yes, alone. My crew did not survive the hit, only me." The human Grace looked at the wreckage behind her. "My ship is destroyed, cannot fly again, cannot call for help. My communication system is dead." Lowered his weapon slightly. This soft, broken creature was no threat to them. "We should leave it here," he said "It is not our concern." But hesitated. There was something in the human's eyes. Despite the injuries, despite the impossible situation, there was no despair there. Only a kind of calm watchfulness that reminded him of veteran soldiers. "What is happening here?" Grace asked. "I saw armies in the valley. I heard explosions before I crashed. What is this place?" Saw no reason to lie. "This is IV. We are soldiers. The forces you saw are the Crucible Dominion. They are invaders. They have destroyed our main army and they are coming to destroy us." Grace absorbed this information. "How many of you?" 43. Wounded. Low on ammunition. No communication with our command. "How many of them?" 2,000. The human was silent for a moment. Then she did something that confused completely. She smiled. "Bad situation," she said. "Very bad situation." She looked toward the hills where the ridge lay hidden. "Where is your position?" "South of here, a ridge overlooking the valley." "Defensible." Frowned. "We have cover. We have the high ground. But against 2,000 it does not matter." Grace nodded slowly. Then she said something that made all 4 soldiers stare at her in disbelief. "Can I join the fight?" Actually laughed. You are injured, you have no weapon, you are soft and small. What could you possibly do?" The human did not seem offended. "I am pilot. Before that I was soldier. 5 years ground combat. I know fighting. I know tactics. I know how to hurt enemies when outnumbered." Studied her again. The broken arm, the bleeding cuts, the impossibly fragile body. This creature should be begging them for help, not offering to fight in a hopeless battle. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you join a fight that is not yours? We are strangers, you owe us nothing." Grace considered the question carefully. When she answered, her voice was quiet but steady. "Because you need help, and I am here is simple." Had no response to that. He looked at who shrugged his uninjured shoulder. "Commander will want to see this," said finally. "Can you walk?" "Yes, I can walk." "Then come with us, quickly. We must return before dawn." They salvaged what they could from the wreckage. Some tools, some emergency supplies, a few containers of unfamiliar substances. Grace explained that some of it was fuel highly flammable, potentially useful. Then they began the journey back to the ridge. Grace kept pace despite her injuries, never complaining, never asking them to slow down. Found himself watching her with growing curiosity. What kind of creature volunteered to die for strangers? By the time they reached the ridge, the first light of dawn was touching the eastern sky. The Dominion would be moving soon. Led Grace to the command post where Commander waited. As they approached, 4 eyes widened with surprise. "What is this?" she asked. "A survivor from the crash, Commander. A human. Survey pilot, calls herself Grace." Grace stepped forward, straightening despite her injuries. "Commander, I understand you are outnumbered. I understand you expect to die. I am soldier. I want to help." Stared at the small, broken creature standing before her. The soft skin, the single pair of arms, the obvious injuries. "You want to help," repeated slowly. "You want to join our fight." "Yes." "Why?" Grace met her eyes without hesitation. because you are standing alone against great enemy, and where I am from, we do not watch others stand alone." The sun continued to rise. In the valley below, 2,000 enemies were beginning to march. And on the ridge, a commander found herself looking at a strange human woman and wondering if the universe had just offered her something unexpected, something that might change everything. Commander sat on a flat rock and studied the human before her. Grace stood with surprising steadiness despite her obvious injuries. One arm was clearly broken, the bone probably shattered from the crash. Cuts covered her face. Dark bruises were spreading across her soft skin, yet she stood there calmly, waiting. "Sit," said finally, "before you fall." Grace lowered herself onto a nearby rock. She moved carefully, protecting her damaged arm, but her eyes remained alert. She was scanning the ridge, looking at the positions, the terrain, the soldiers. "Tell me about yourself," said. "You say you were a soldier before you were a pilot." "Yes, 5 years in ground combat. Infantry first, then special operations. I left military service 3 years ago to become survey pilot, exploring new systems, mapping planets, peaceful work." Grace smiled slightly. "Usually peaceful. What happened to your ship?" "Wrong place at wrong time. I was surveying the outer planets when your war arrived in this system. My ship was hit by stray fire from the orbital battle. I barely made it to atmosphere before systems failed completely." Nodded. That matched what her people knew of the battle above. The Dominion fleet had crushed the orbital defense in less than a day. "You said you want to help," said, "but I must understand why. You are injured, you are far from home, you have no reason to care whether we live or die, yet you offer to fight with us. This makes no sense to me." Grace was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "Among my people there is concept. We call it standing with. When you see someone fighting alone, someone smaller facing something bigger, you do not walk away. You stand with them, even if you cannot win, even if it costs you everything." That seems like a good way to die uselessly. Maybe, but it is what makes us human. We do not measure worth by victory alone. We measure by whether we tried. Considered this. It was a strange philosophy. They valued honor and courage, yes, but they also valued wisdom. Fighting battles you could not win was considered foolish, not noble. Yet here she was, preparing to do exactly that. "Even if I accept your offer," said, "what can you actually do? You are one person with one arm. My soldiers are trained warriors with plasma lances and combat experience. What does one injured human add to this fight?" Grace leaned forward slightly. "May I see your tactical situation?" Hesitated, then gestured for Lieutenant to bring the tactical display. The device was damaged but still functional. It projected a rough map of the ridge and the surrounding valley. Grace studied it carefully. Her eyes moved across the terrain, tracing lines and positions. She asked questions about elevation, cover, approach routes. She asked about the enemy's weapons, their armor, their tactics. "You have been fighting them directly," Grace said finally, "meeting their forces head-on, matching strength against strength." "That is how war is fought," said stiffly. "It is the honorable way." "Honorable, yes, but you are outnumbered 50-1. Honor will not save you." Scales darkened with anger. "You speak of cowardice, of hiding and running." "No," Grace met his eyes calmly. "I speak of winning, or at least of making the enemy bleed so badly that your deaths matter." She stood slowly and walked to the edge of the ridge, looking down at the valley. The Dominion forces were visible now, a dark mass moving through the morning mist. "When my people are outnumbered," Grace said, "we do not fight fair, we use the terrain, we set traps, we strike from unexpected directions and disappear before the enemy can respond. We make every shadow dangerous, we make the enemy afraid." "That is not the way," said. "Then the way will see you all dead before midday." Grace turned back to face them. "I mean no disrespect. Your courage is clear, But courage alone does not stop plasma bolts. Raised a hand to silence before he could respond. What exactly are you proposing? Grace returned to the tactical display. Your ridge is narrow. Only a few approaches where their numbers can be used effectively. We block those approaches. Debris, explosives, anything that slows them down and forces them into kill zones. She pointed to several locations on the map. We create false positions, make them think we are defending here but actually strike from there. We hit them, we move, we hit again from somewhere else. Never let them know where we really are. We do not have explosives, said. The fuel from my ship. It is highly flammable. Combined with the chemicals in your emergency supplies, we can create simple but effective bombs. Not powerful enough to destroy armor, but enough to cause chaos and injuries. Was beginning to understand. This human did not think like a. She thought like a predator, looking for weaknesses and exploiting them without mercy. And the traps. Pits covered with vegetation. Trip wires connected to falling rocks. Anything that slows their advance and makes them cautious. Every minute they spend being careful is a minute your soldiers can rest and reposition. Stepped forward. This is not how warriors fight. This is how cowards fight. Grace turned to him. Her voice was soft, but her eyes were hard. Lieutenant, let me ask you something. When you die tomorrow, what happens to your people, your family, your home? Hesitated. The Dominion will continue their conquest. Others will fight them. And if you lived, if you survived this battle and continued to resist? That is not possible. Maybe not, but what if it was? What if your survival, your continued resistance, mattered more than a glorious death? Would you still call it cowardice to fight smart instead of fighting fair? The silence stretched, finally spoke. In the old stories, she said slowly, our ancestors survived through cleverness as often as courage. They used the terrain, the weather, every advantage they could find. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that. We became so focused on honor that we forgot how to survive. She stood and looked at her soldiers, 43 wounded warriors preparing to die. Dying uselessly is not honor, she said. Dying while your enemy laughs at how easy it was is not honor, but making them pay for every step, making them fear every shadow, making them remember this ridge long after we are gone, that is something. She turned to Grace. Show us the human way of war. Grace nodded. Despite her injuries, despite the impossible odds, there was something like hope in her eyes. We have maybe 4 hours before they reach us, she said. Let us get to work. The soldiers began to move with new purpose. They had come here to die. Now perhaps they had come here to fight. And in the center of it all, a small, broken human woman began to teach ancient warriors the terrible art of making enemies suffer. The 4 hours before the Dominion arrived were the busiest of life. Grace directed the work with quiet efficiency, showing them where to dig pits, where to place explosives, where to position shooters for maximum effect. At first, the soldiers were skeptical. Many shared view that these tactics were beneath them. But as the preparations took shape, something changed. They began to see the ridge not as a place to die, but as a weapon. Grace worked alongside them despite her injuries. She refused to rest, refused to let anyone splint her arm properly because it would take too long. Watched her drag heavy pieces of wreckage into position with her one good arm, her face pale with pain, but her movements never stopping. You will kill yourself before the enemy arrives, said. Then I will die working, Grace replied. Better than dying waiting. By mid-morning, the ridge had been transformed. The main approach paths were now kill zones, covered by overlapping fields of fire from hidden positions. False camps had been set up with makeshift figures to draw enemy attention. Explosives made from ship fuel and chemical supplies were buried at key points. Pits lined with sharpened stakes waited beneath thin covers of vegetation. Grace gathered the soldiers for final instructions. Her translator struggled with some concepts, but her meaning was clear. "Do not stay in one place," she told them. "Shoot, then move. Never let them know where you really are. When they advance toward your position, you should already be somewhere else, shooting at them from a new angle." "What about standing our ground?" one soldier asked. "What about holding the line?" "There is no line. There is only movement. You are not a wall to be broken. You are water flowing around their attacks, striking where they do not expect." Grace paused. "And when you kill an enemy, do not celebrate. Move immediately. Because where you were standing is about to be targeted by every weapon they have." Corporal raised her hand. "How do we know when it is over? When do we stop running and make our final stand?" Grace looked at her steadily. "When we run out of ground, when there is nowhere left to retreat, then, yes, we stand. But that is the last resort, not the first." The soldiers dispersed to their hidden positions, stayed with Grace at the central observation point, a small natural depression near the top of the ridge where they could see the entire battlefield. "You should hide too," said. "You are too injured to fight." Grace checked the plasma pistol she had been given, one of the few spare weapons they had. "I can still shoot, and I can still move. That is enough." The Dominion forces appeared at the edge of the valley. From this distance, they looked like a dark wave spreading across the ground. 2,000 soldiers, heavily armored, carrying weapons that could punch through rock. Against them stood 43 wounded and 1 broken human. The Dominion commander was clearly confident. His forces advanced in standard formation, not bothering with scouts or caution. Why would they? They had crushed the main army in a single battle. This was just cleanup. The first wave entered the kill zone. Grace waited until they were perfectly positioned, then triggered the first explosives. The blast was not powerful enough to destroy armor, but it did not need to be. The force threw soldiers off their feet. The flames ignited vegetation and created smoke that obscured their vision. And in that moment of chaos, they opened fire from 3 different directions. Watched in amazement as enemy soldiers fell. They tried to return fire, but they did not know where the shots were coming from. Every time they aimed at one position, fire came from somewhere else. Then, exactly as Grace had instructed, the shooters moved. By the time the Dominion forces concentrated their fire on the shooting positions, those positions were empty. The first wave retreated in confusion, leaving behind 24 bodies. Turned to Grace with new respect in her eyes. "That was effective." "That was the easy part," Grace replied. "They were not expecting it. The next wave will be more careful." She was right. The second assault came with more caution. The Dominion soldiers spread out, moving in smaller groups, providing cover for each other. They advanced slowly, checking for traps. They found some of them. Soldiers triggered hidden pits and fell onto sharpened stakes. Others set off explosives that left them burned and screaming. But they learned quickly, adjusting their advance to avoid the worst dangers. The fighting became brutal. They continued their hit-and-run tactics, but the Dominion forces were adapting. They started leaving soldiers behind to watch for flanking movements. They began advancing in a wider formation that was harder to concentrate fire against. Grace took up a position on the eastern slope, where the fighting was heaviest. Lost track of her for nearly an hour. When she found Grace again, the human was covered in blood. Some of it was her own. A new wound on her leg made her limp badly. Her broken arm had been hit again, and the pain must have been incredible. But she was still fighting, still moving, still shooting. "You should fall back," said. "Rest." Grace shook her head. "No time. They are pushing too hard on this side. If we lose the eastern slope, they will flank the main position." She limped back toward the fighting and followed. By midday, the Dominion had lost nearly a third of their forces. The valley was littered with bodies, but the defenders were exhausted, nearly out of ammunition, and running out of room to retreat. Grace collapsed against a rock, breathing hard. Her face was gray with pain and blood loss, crouched beside her. "You have given us more than we could have hoped for," said. "Whatever happens now, we will remember you." Grace managed a weak smile, not done yet, still breathing. Below them, the Dominion forces were massing for a final assault. The enemy commander had clearly decided to end this. Every remaining soldier was moving into position. "They will come at us with everything," said. "We cannot survive that." "No," Grace agreed, "we probably cannot." She pulled something from her pocket, a small device that did not recognize. "Before my ship lost power," Grace said quietly, "I sent a distress signal, human emergency frequency, long range." Stared at her. "There are no human forces in this sector." "No, but humans are explorers. We are everywhere, even where we are not supposed to be, and we always answer distress calls." "You think someone will come?" Grace looked up at the sky. I hope, and hope is sometimes enough." The Dominion forces began their final advance, raised her plasma lance, preparing for the end. But in the back of her mind, she found herself hopping too. Hopping that somewhere in the vast emptiness above them, someone had heard Grace's call. And was coming. The Dominion assault came like a wave of metal and fire. 1,200 soldiers, all that remained of the original force, charged up the ridge in a single overwhelming push. No more caution, no more probing attacks, just raw fury and superior numbers. Fired her plasma lance until the charge indicator hit 0. Then she drew her blade and prepared to die. Around her, the surviving soldiers fought with everything they had left. Sergeant was down, wounded badly but still crawling toward the enemy. Corporal stood over him, protecting him with her own body. Lieutenant, his injured arm forgotten, swung his blade with his remaining good arms. Grace was still fighting, could not understand how. The human had lost too much blood, taken too many wounds, pushed her fragile body far beyond its limits. Yet she kept moving, kept shooting, kept finding new positions to strike from. The Dominion forces pushed up the final slope. They were less than 50 meters away now, close enough that could see the hatred in their eyes, close enough that she knew this was the end. She grabbed Grace and pulled her behind a rock. The human was barely conscious, her breathing shallow and weak. "Thank you," said, "for everything. You gave us a warrior's death worth remembering." Grace's eyes fluttered open. She looked up at the sky and smiled strangely. "Not done yet," she whispered. Followed her gaze upward, and then she saw it. The sky split open. A ship, larger than any shuttle but smaller than a warship, tore through the atmosphere in a streak of fire. It was moving impossibly fast, decelerating with a violence that should have torn it apart. The Dominion soldiers stopped their advance, staring upward in confusion. The ship leveled out barely 100 meters above the valley and opened fire. Had seen plasma weapons before. She had seen the destruction they could cause, but she had never seen anything like this. The ship's weapons carved through the Dominion forces like a blade through water, soldiers vaporized, armor melted, the ground itself burned. Then the ship's side opened and smaller craft dropped out, landing pods, a dozen of them falling toward the ridge. The pods hit the ground hard, their doors blowing open before they had even stopped moving. Figures emerged. They were shaped like Grace, but larger, wrapped in heavy armor that made them look like walking fortresses. They carried weapons that hummed with barely contained power. And they were angry. The armored humans slammed into the Dominion forces with terrifying efficiency. They moved like Grace had described, never staying in one place, always striking from unexpected angles. But where Grace had been one injured pilot with a small weapon, these were trained soldiers with heavy armor and overwhelming firepower. The Dominion commander tried to rally his forces. It was useless. Within minutes, the remaining enemy soldiers were in full retreat, scrambling down the ridge and fleeing across the valley. The ship followed them. its weapons burning any group that tried to regroup. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Silence fell across the ridge. The survivors stood among the bodies of their enemies, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. One of the armored humans approached. The helmet retracted, revealing a male face. Hard eyes, weathered skin, a jaw set with determination. He looked around at the wounded soldiers, at the improvised defenses, at the evidence of the desperate battle that had been fought here. Then he looked down at Grace, still barely conscious against the rock. "Grace," he said, his voice was deep and calm, "you look terrible." Grace managed a weak laugh. "Nice to see you too, you took your time." The man crouched beside her. "We came as fast as we could. Your signal was weak, we almost missed it." He looked at her wounds with professional concern. "Medic over here." More armored humans rushed forward, carrying medical equipment. They began working on Grace immediately, injecting her with substances that made her breathing stabilize. Stepped forward. "You are the reinforcements. You came because of her signal." Stood and faced her. He was taller than Grace but had the same calm steadiness in his eyes. "Captain Cole," he said, "commander of the Resolute Dawn, we picked up an emergency signal on human frequency and came to investigate." He looked around the battlefield again. "I expected to find a crashed pilot. Instead, I find a war." "Your pilot found us," said. "She helped us. She fought with us. We would have died hours ago without her." Nodded slowly. "That sounds like Grace." He paused. "I must ask, Commander, this war of yours, who are the aggressors?" "The Crucible Dominion. They invaded our space 3 cycles ago. They have been conquering our worlds ever since." "And you are the Defenders." "We are what remains of the Defenders," gestured at her wounded soldiers. "This is all that is left of my battalion." Was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "The Resolute Dawn is an exploration vessel, not a warship. But we have weapons, and we have trained soldiers. More importantly, we have communications equipment that can reach human space." Felt her hearts begin to beat faster. "You would help us. You would become involved in our war." Grace already made us involved. Looked down at the unconscious pilot now being loaded onto a stretcher. "She asked if she could join your fight. That is what she does. That is what humans do." He met eyes. "We see someone standing alone against the darkness and we stand with them, even if we have no stake in the outcome, even if it costs us everything." Remembered Grace's words from the night before. The concept of standing with. She had thought it was just philosophy. Now she understood it was something deeper, something fundamental to these strange, soft creatures. "Why?" she asked. "Why do humans do this?" Smiled slightly. It was the first warmth she had seen in his face. "Because the galaxy is too dark to face alone. Because every species that stands against tyranny makes the universe a little brighter. Because someday we might be the ones who need help, and we hope that when that day comes, someone will stand with us too." The sons of IV continued their slow journey across the sky. On the ridge, soldiers and human marines began to work together, treating wounds, securing the area, preparing for whatever came next. And in the middle of it all, Commander began to draft a message, a request for alliance, an invitation to stand together. They had come to this ridge with a broken spear, expecting to die. Instead, they had found something better. They had found friends.